Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional stories like this. Your support keeps these stories coming. The moment Adrian Blackwood walked into the gallery, the room subtly shifted, like the air itself recognized authority. Conversations softened, laughter dipped, and more than a few heads turned. It wasn't just his tailored charcoal suit or the quiet confidence in his stride. It was the reputation that followed him everywhere, unseen yet unmistakable. Adrian didn't announce himself. He never needed to. Across the room, unaware of the eyes that had just locked onto her, stood Elena Rivera. She was studying a painting, something abstract, all deep blues and fractured light. Her hands clasped behind her back, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to the canvas speak. She wore a simple ivory dress, nothing flashy, nothing designed to steal attention. And yet she did, effortlessly. Adrian stopped walking. It wasn't love. It wasn't even desire, not yet. It was something sharper, recognition. The unsettling sense that something important had just stepped into his world uninvited. "Who's that?" he asked quietly. Marcus Hale, his longtime associate, followed Adrian's gaze. Marcus had seen many women catch people's attention, models, socialites, influencers, but the woman by the painting had a different effect. She wasn't performing. She simply existed. "No idea," Marcus replied, "but she's beautiful." Adrian didn't answer right away. His eyes never left her. "Yes," he said finally, voice calm, controlled. "And she's not here by accident." Marcus raised an eyebrow, amused, already claiming territory. Adrian's jaw tightened just slightly. "I don't claim what isn't mine." Then, after a pause, he added, quieter but firmer, "But she will be." Elena felt it before she saw him, that strange prickle at the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, expecting maybe a curious stranger or an overly bold admirer. Instead, her eyes met Adrian Blackwood. She didn't know his name, not yet, but something about him made her breath hitch. He stood apart from the crowd, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed yet coiled like a predator at rest. His gaze wasn't rude, it wasn't hungry, it was certain. Elena looked away first, unsettled by how exposed she suddenly felt. "Get it together," she muttered to herself, refocusing on the painting. She wasn't here for distractions. This exhibition was important, her first major showcase as a freelance art consultant. One successful night could change everything. Still, she could feel him moving closer, the space around her subtly narrowing. "Do you like it?" a deep voice asked behind her. She turned. Up close, he was even more imposing. Tall, broad-shouldered, sharp features softened only slightly by curiosity in his dark eyes. "I do," she said carefully. "It feels unfinished, honest." A corner of his mouth lifted. "Most people say it's chaotic." "Chaos is honest," she replied. "Perfection is usually a lie." That earned her a full smile, brief but real. "I'm Adrian," he said, extending his hand. "Elena," she shook it, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt up her arm. She pulled back too quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. He had. "You're not from this world," Adrian said, glancing around the gallery. Elena laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "You're not trying to impress anyone," he said. "That's rare here." "And you," she asked before she could stop herself, "are you?" Adrian studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "No," he said, "I already know who I am." The honesty of that answer unsettled her more than any flirtation could have. Across the room, Marcus watched the interaction with growing interest. Adrian didn't approach people like this. He didn't linger. He certainly didn't look at someone the way he was looking at Elena Rivera, as if the rest of the room had dissolved. Another man drifted closer to Elena then, young, polished, clearly confident. "Elena, right?" he said, smiling too easily. "I loved your commentary during the panel." Before Elena could respond, Adrian stepped subtly closer, his presence unmistakable. "She's busy," Adrian said calmly. The man hesitated. "I just wanted to." Adrian's gaze hardened just a fraction. "Later." It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was final. The man retreated, confusion written across his face. Elena stared at Adrian. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said, but I wanted to. That was bold. Yes. She should have been annoyed. Instead, her heart was racing. Marcus appeared at Adrian's side, lowering his voice. Careful, he murmured. People will talk. Adrian didn't look away from Elena. Let them. Then, as if realizing something, Elena stepped back. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you don't get to decide who talks to me. Adrian nodded slowly. You're right. Relief flickered across her face, until he added, but I do decide who gets access to what's mine. Her eyes widened. I'm not. Not yet, he said quietly, but you will be. The words should have angered her. Instead, they sent a strange shiver through her, equal parts fear and intrigue. This is where I walk away, Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice. Adrian stepped aside, giving her space. Of course. She left, heels clicking against the polished floor, refusing to look back. Adrian watched her go, expression unreadable. Marcus exhaled slowly. You just scared her off. Adrian's lips curved faintly. No, he said. I just made sure she remembers me. And as Elena stepped out into the cool night air, one thought echoed in her mind, uninvited and impossible to ignore. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Elena didn't sleep that night. No matter how many times she replayed the evening in her mind, Adrian Blackwood's voice lingered, calm, controlled, and far too certain. She told herself it was irritation keeping her awake, not curiosity. Men like him were predictable in their own dangerous way, used to control, used to obedience, mistaking confidence for entitlement. And yet, something about him hadn't fit that familiar pattern. He hadn't chased her when she walked away. He hadn't apologized either. He had simply let her go, as if the choice itself amused him. The next morning, Elena buried herself in work. Emails, proposals, follow-ups, anything to drown out thought. By noon, she was reviewing a potential client's private collection in a downtown high-rise, grateful for the distraction. Art made sense. It didn't pretend. It didn't manipulate. It existed to be felt, not possessed. She was mid-sentence explaining a piece when her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Elena Rivera. This is Adrian Blackwood. We need to talk. Her pulse spiked despite herself. She didn't reply. 5 minutes later, another message appeared. I don't like unfinished conversations. She stared at the screen, annoyance flaring. Slowly, deliberately, she typed back. Then you should choose your words more carefully. The response came almost instantly. Lunch, 1 hour. I'll send the location. She laughed under her breath, a sharp, incredulous sound. The audacity was unreal. And yet, when the address came through, a quiet cafe she loved but rarely saw crowded, her irritation softened into something more complicated. He hadn't chosen a flashy restaurant. He'd chosen neutral ground. Against her better judgment, she went. Adrian was already there when she arrived, seated by the window, jacket draped over the chair beside him. He stood when he saw her, not rushed, not theatrical, just respectful. It unsettled her more than arrogance would have. You came, he said. I'm curious, Elena replied, not compliant. A faint smile touched his lips. I'll take curiosity. They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, traffic moved in steady rhythm, the city unaware of the tension inside the small cafe. You don't usually back down, Elena said finally. Men like you. Men like me, Adrian echoed. Used to getting what they want. His gaze didn't waver. You assume I want something from you. Don't you? Yes, he said simply, but not ownership, not control. She studied his face, searching for the lie. Then what? Understanding, he said, and time. She frowned. That's vague. It's honest. Silence stretched again, heavier this time. I crossed a line last night, Adrian continued. Not by speaking, by assuming. Elena blinked, caught off guard. That doesn't sound like an apology. It's not, he said calmly. "I don't apologize for noticing you or for intervening. I apologize for not explaining myself." Her defenses wavered just a little. "Explain, then." "That man who approached you," Adrian said, "he works for a firm I'm currently dismantling. Slowly, strategically. Anyone connected to him becomes leverage. I didn't want you pulled into that." Elena stiffened. "You could have told me." "Yes," he agreed, "and you wouldn't have believed me." She hated that he was probably right. "So you decided for me," she said. "I protected a boundary," Adrian replied. "Yours." She searched his eyes again. There was no triumph there, no hunger, just resolve. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, "but I intend to." That should have sent her running. Instead, she asked, "Why?" Adrian leaned back slightly. "Because you walked away." She scoffed. "That's it." "Most people don't," he said. "They stay, they angle, they wait for advantage. You chose distance. That tells me who you are." Elena absorbed that, unsure how to respond. Across town, Marcus Hale was having a very different conversation. "You're distracted," he said over the phone. "This isn't like you." "It is now," Adrian replied. "You don't mix personal interest with strategy." "She's not a strategy." Marcus sighed. "That's exactly my concern." Back at the cafe, lunch arrived, mostly untouched. The tension between them had softened, replaced by something quieter but more dangerous, understanding. "I won't interfere with your life," Adrian said, "but I won't disappear either." Elena met his gaze. "You don't get to decide that." "No," he said, "you do." She stood, gathering her bag. "This doesn't mean anything changes." "I know," Adrian said, "but something already has." She paused, then nodded once before leaving. That night, Elena stood on her balcony, city lights stretching endlessly below. Adrian hadn't followed. He hadn't pressured. He'd left space, and somehow that space felt louder than his presence. Across the city, Adrian poured himself a drink, staring out at a skyline he'd conquered piece by piece. For the first time in years, control felt optional. Risk felt necessary. And somewhere between distance and desire, something irreversible had begun. The following weeks unfolded with an unsettling rhythm, one Elena didn't remember agreeing to yet found herself adjusting to. Adrian never showed up uninvited. He never interrupted her work or inserted himself into her schedule. Instead, he existed on the edges, an occasional message asking how her day had gone, a recommendation for a book she'd mentioned in passing, a quiet presence that neither crowded nor faded. It was infuriating how deliberate it all felt. She told herself she could stop responding anytime. She didn't. Their next meeting wasn't planned. It happened in a bookstore, of all places. Elena was reaching for a volume on modern expressionism when a familiar hand appeared beside hers, pulling down a different title from the same shelf. She didn't need to look to know who it was. "You have a habit of choosing the difficult sections," Adrian said. She turned, startled despite herself. "Do you follow me now?" He held up the book. "Coincidence. I don't believe in them, but they happen." She hesitated, then sighed. "You could at least pretend to." They stood there for a moment, the quiet hum of the store wrapping around them. It felt oddly normal, too normal, for two people who existed in such different worlds. "You never asked what I do," Adrian said. "I know what you do," Elena replied. "At least the version everyone knows." "And the version you think you know?" he asked. She studied him. "Power, control, influence. I don't see much room for softness in that." His gaze darkened, not with anger but something closer to recognition. "Softness exists," he said. "It's just expensive." That answer stayed with her longer than she expected. They began talking more after that, really talking. Not flirting, not posturing. Conversations stretched late into the night, ranging from art and architecture to fear and ambition. Adrian spoke about responsibility like it was a weight he'd learned to carry alone. Elena spoke about independence like it was something she'd fought for and refused to surrender. They challenged each other without raising their voices. Neither backed down. Neither tried to win. Still, boundaries blurred. The first time Adrian touched her again, it was accidental, or so they both pretended. They were standing close, reviewing a piece in a private collection she'd been hired to assess. He leaned in to point out a detail, his hand brushing her lower back for less than a second. The contact was brief, professional even, but Elena felt it everywhere. She stepped away immediately. That can't happen. I know, Adrian said, withdrawing just as fast. I won't let it. The honesty in his voice made it harder, not easier. Marcus noticed the shift before anyone else. Adrian was sharper, more focused, yet somehow less rigid. Decisions came faster, but his temper, once infamous, was notably absent. You're changing, Marcus said one evening. No, Adrian replied. I'm prioritizing. That's worse, Marcus muttered. Elena's world shifted too. She found herself second-guessing choices she'd once made without hesitation. Not because Adrian asked her to, but because his presence forced her to examine why she made them in the first place. It scared her how easily he slipped into her thoughts, how naturally he fit into the quiet spaces of her life. The inevitable conflict arrived without drama. She was offered a major opportunity, a long-term contract overseas, the kind that could define a career. When she told Adrian, she expected resistance. What she got was silence. You're thinking of taking it, he said finally. Yes, she replied. I worked for this. I know, he said. She waited. That's it. What do you want me to say? Adrian asked. That I don't want you to go. She crossed her arms. Do you? Yes, he said without hesitation, but I won't ask you to stay. Her chest tightened. Why not? Because the moment I do, he said quietly, I become the thing you're afraid of. The truth of that hit harder than any argument could have. They stood there, the unspoken heavy between them. Nothing has happened between us, Elena said, and yet it feels like everything has. Adrian nodded. That's the danger. The night before her departure, they met once more, not planned, not announced, just drawn. They stood on a rooftop overlooking the city, the air thick with things unsaid. If I go, Elena said, this changes. Yes, Adrian agreed. If I stay, she continued, it changes too. Yes, he said again. She laughed softly. You're impossible. And you're honest, he replied. That's worse. They stood close, closer than ever before. His hand hovered near hers, not touching, waiting. You don't get to claim me, Elena said, voice steady but quiet. I know, Adrian said. I only get to choose whether I'm here. She looked up at him then, really looked. And are you? Yes, he said, without apology. For a moment, the world held its breath. Elena reached out first. Not to surrender, but to choose. And somewhere in the city below, lines that had once been clear began to disappear entirely. Elena left the city 2 days later, not because she was running, but because she needed clarity that could not exist while Adrian Blackwood stood so close to her resolve. The plane lifted through a blanket of gray clouds, and with it went the fragile balance she had been trying to maintain. She told herself the ache in her chest was only uncertainty, not loss, only habit, not attachment. Across the ocean, she settled into a temporary apartment overlooking narrow streets and old stone buildings, immersing herself in work with a discipline that bordered on desperation. Days blurred into meetings, evaluations, and long walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods where no one knew her name or the man who had unsettled her so completely. And yet, even there, distance did not erase presence. Adrian never flooded her phone with messages. He sent none at all the first week. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. When his first message finally came, it was simple and almost unfairly gentle, asking if she had arrived safely. She stared at the screen for a long time before replying, aware that every word reopened a door she had not fully closed. From that point on, communication resumed in a careful rhythm, respectful and restrained, like two people walking opposite sides of a fragile bridge. They spoke about work, about cities, about the quiet shock of missing someone you never promised yourself to. Nothing explicit passed between them, yet everything meaningful did. Meanwhile, in the city she had left behind, Adrian felt the absence in ways he had not anticipated. Control had always been his anchor, structure his armor, but with Elena gone, the systems he had mastered felt hollow. Meetings ended faster, deals closed cleaner, yet satisfaction never followed. Marcus noticed the difference immediately, not in performance but in restraint. Adrian no longer filled silence with dominance. He let it exist. That unsettled people more than anger ever had. Whispers began to circulate, not about weakness, but about distraction, and Adrian learned quickly that vulnerability invited scrutiny in a world that thrived on certainty. Still, he did not retreat. He adjusted. Elena's world abroad expanded even as her internal conflict tightened. Opportunity followed opportunity. Affirmation came from respected voices, and her independence felt validated. Yet every achievement carried an echo of someone she wished she could tell without consequence. One evening, after a particularly long day, she found herself standing in a small gallery after hours, surrounded by art that spoke of longing and restraint, and she realized the truth she had been avoiding. Leaving had not diminished what she felt, it had clarified it. The connection was no longer fueled by proximity or tension, but by choice, and that frightened her more than desire ever had. Weeks passed, then months, and when Adrian finally visited the city under the pretense of business, they agreed to meet without expectations. The cafe was modest, the kind of place where conversations blended into the background, and when they saw each other, there was no dramatic pause, no sharp intake of breath, only recognition softened by time. They spoke easily, honestly, like people who had stopped pretending something did not exist. Adrian did not ask her to return. Elena did not ask him to wait. Instead, they acknowledged the space between them as something neither enemy nor obstacle, but a measure of respect. That night, as they walked through quiet streets lit by old lamps, the city felt suspended, holding their reflection in its glass windows as if witnessing something deliberate and rare. They stopped at a bridge, leaning against cool stone, the water below moving steadily forward. Elena spoke first, admitting that independence did not mean isolation, that strength did not require denial. Adrian listened, not interrupting, not correcting, simply present, and when he spoke, it was with the clarity of someone who had finally named his own truth, that power meant nothing if it could not coexist with choice. When their hands touched this time, it was neither accidental nor hesitant. It was measured, mutual, and unmistakably intentional. There was no claiming, no surrender, only recognition that something real had survived distance without demanding sacrifice. When they parted that night, it was without promises, but also without fear, and as Elena walked back to her apartment, she understood that some connections did not trap or consume, they waited. Back home, Adrian returned to a city that felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. He no longer confused possession with presence, nor certainty with control. Elena returned weeks later, not permanently, not temporarily, but consciously, stepping back into a life she had not abandoned, only expanded. When they saw each other again in the same city where it had begun, the air between them was steady, grounded, no longer charged with unspoken tension, but alive with possibility. They stood together, not bound by fear or expectation, but by the quiet understanding that choosing someone did not mean losing yourself. And for the first time since their paths crossed, what lay ahead did not feel dangerous, only honest. The return to the city did not go unnoticed, because nothing connected to Adrian Blackwood ever truly existed in private, and Elena felt that pressure almost immediately, not as open hostility, but as subtle resistance, a tightening of doors that once opened easily and conversations that ended a second too soon. It was not jealousy that followed her, but curiosity sharpened into suspicion, as if the world around Adrian sensed a shift and wanted to test its limits. Elena remained focused on her work, determined not to let perception define her place, yet she could not ignore how often her name now appeared in rooms she had never entered. Adrian, for his part, anticipated the reaction and moved with calculated calm, never shielding her, never displaying her as proof of influence, but also never distancing himself to appease others. That balance unsettled people more than dominance ever had. Marcus confronted him directly one evening, pointing out that alliances were fragile and enemies patient, warning that emotional transparency created leverage. But Adrian listened without defensiveness and replied with a quiet certainty that startled even his closest ally, saying that leverage only mattered if you feared losing control, and he no longer did. Elena heard echoes of this resolve when invitations began arriving that were not for her alone, but for them together, carefully worded and cautiously extended, as if the city itself was trying to understand the rules of something new. At one such gathering, Elena observed the shift firsthand, noting how conversations paused when she approached, how eyes measured her not for weakness, but for influence she had never sought, and she realized that being seen beside Adrian did not erase her identity but complicated it, demanding clarity about who she was willing to be. Adrian never spoke for her, never redirected attention toward himself, and when she was addressed directly, he stepped back just enough to make it clear that proximity did not equal possession. That restraint earned her respect faster than she expected, though it also drew sharper attention from those who thrived on imbalance. The first real challenge came quietly, wrapped in opportunity, when Elena was approached with an offer that seemed generous but felt calculated, a proposal to lead a project funded by interests openly opposed to Adrian's long-term strategy. The implication was clear even if the words were not. Acceptance would create distance, refusal would define loyalty. Elena did not bring it to Adrian immediately, choosing instead to sit with the weight of the choice alone, recognizing it as a test not of love but of autonomy. When she finally told him, she expected reaction, advice, perhaps even anger, but Adrian surprised her again by asking only one question, whether the project aligned with her values, and when she admitted that it did not, he nodded and said the rest was irrelevant. That response shifted something fundamental between them, because it confirmed that the space he had promised was real, not conditional. Still, consequences followed. The offer vanished, replaced by subtle exclusion, and Elena felt the sting of doors closing, not because of Adrian, but because she had chosen integrity over advancement. Adrian noticed the impact immediately and adjusted without announcement, redirecting resources, introducing her work to circles untouched by the previous ones, not as compensation, but as amplification of what already existed. Elena understood the difference, and it mattered. Yet with every step forward, the pressure intensified, and whispers turned into narratives, some casting her as a distraction, others as an influence, few as an equal. One night, after a particularly long day, Elena confronted Adrian about it, not accusing, but honest, admitting that the scrutiny was exhausting, and that sometimes she wondered whether choosing him meant constantly proving herself. Adrian listened, then answered with a truth that did not soften the reality but reframed it, saying that the world always demanded proof from those who refused to be simplified, and that standing beside power only made that demand louder, but it did not create it. He told her that if she ever felt the cost outweighed the meaning, he would understand, and for the first time, Elena saw the risk he carried not as dominance but as willingness to lose. That night, when they stood together in quiet understanding, the city outside restless and watchful, Elena realized that what bound them was not desire or defiance, but choice made repeatedly under pressure. The world would continue to push, to test, to demand definitions that fit its comfort, but neither of them seemed willing to comply. And as they moved forward, not shielded from consequence but strengthened by clarity, it became clear that the greatest threat was not opposition, but the temptation to retreat into something easier. They did not. Instead, they stood where they were, unclaimed and unapologetic, allowing the world to adjust or fall away, knowing that whatever came next would not be taken, but chosen. The tension that followed them did not explode all at once but accumulated quietly, like pressure beneath a sealed surface, and Elena began to sense it in the smallest details, in delayed responses, in meetings that shifted locations without explanation, in the way certain names stopped appearing on her calendar as if erased rather than declined. She understood then that choosing integrity did not end conflict. It merely changed its shape. Adrian felt it too, though in different ways, as opposition consolidated not through direct confrontation, but through coordination, old rivals aligning with new motives, all testing whether the steadiness he projected was genuine or performative. He responded with restraint rather than force, refusing to escalate, dismantling assumptions instead of people, and that refusal unsettled those who expected predictable aggression. Elena watched this transformation closely, recognizing that the man who once thrived on control now valued precision over dominance, and while that evolution impressed her, it also exposed him. Power structures did not forgive deviation easily. One evening, after an unexpected cancellation left Elena alone in a half-lit gallery, she realized she was being watched, not overtly followed, but observed with intent that felt clinical rather than threatening. The realization did not frighten her so much as anger her, because it confirmed that proximity to Adrian had made her a point of interest, not as an individual but as a variable. She told Adrian that night, not dramatizing, not minimizing, and his reaction was immediate but controlled, not panic or possessiveness, but a shift in strategy that moved quietly through his network, closing gaps without drawing attention. He did not ask her to withdraw, did not suggest she step back from her work. And that choice mattered more than protection ever could. Still, the weight of awareness changed how Elena moved through the city, sharpening her instincts, reinforcing the understanding that independence did not mean invisibility. Their conversations deepened in response, less about ideas now and more about consequence, about what it meant to exist authentically in spaces that preferred compliance. And Elena found herself admitting fears she had never named aloud. Fears not of harm, but of erosion, of slowly being defined by association rather than intention. Adrian listened, not interrupting, and when he spoke, it was with a rare vulnerability, acknowledging that he had spent years confusing strength with isolation, believing distance was protection, only to realize that connection did not weaken him but clarified what he was willing to defend. That admission reframed everything Elena thought she knew about him, because it revealed a man who had chosen presence over armor, knowing full well the cost. The pressure reached a breaking point when a public narrative began to form, subtle but persistent, framing Elena as an influence behind Adrian's recent restraint, implying that his choices were no longer his own. The implication was strategic, designed to provoke either denial or overcorrection, and Elena felt the weight of it immediately, recognizing the trap for what it was. She offered to step back, not out of fear but out of logic, explaining that distance might neutralize the narrative before it hardened into something more damaging. Adrian did not answer right away, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had been forming long before she spoke, telling her that stepping back would only confirm the lie, that the truth was not something to be hidden simply because it made others uncomfortable. That response terrified her, not because it was reckless, but because it was resolute. The following weeks were difficult, marked by increased scrutiny and calculated provocations, but also by unexpected alliances, people drawn not to Adrian's power but to his consistency, to the way he refused to sacrifice principle for ease. Elena found herself standing beside him in rooms that felt colder than before, answering questions with calm honesty, refusing both defensiveness and apology, and slowly, something shifted. The narrative lost momentum, not because it was disproven, but because it no longer elicited reaction. Standing still, Elena realized, was sometimes the most disruptive act of all. Yet the cost was real, and one night, after a particularly exhausting series of events, Elena broke, not dramatically but quietly, admitting that she was tired of being strong, tired of choosing clarity when silence would be easier. Adrian did not try to fix it, did not offer reassurance wrapped in certainty, but simply sat with her, acknowledging that fatigue did not negate conviction, that rest was not retreat. In that moment, Elena understood that what they shared was not built on intensity or rebellion, but on the willingness to endure discomfort without losing themselves. The city continued to move around them, indifferent and relentless, but within the stillness they claimed, something solid had formed, something neither of them could unchoose. And as dawn approached, light creeping through the windows, Elena realized that standing still, when the world demanded collapse, was not weakness at all, but a form of courage few ever mastered. The calm that followed was deceptive, not because the pressure had eased, but because it had shifted direction, concentrating into a single, inevitable point of impact, and Elena sensed it before it arrived. In the way, conversations grew overly polite and opposition suddenly went quiet, a silence that felt strategic rather than resigned. Adrian recognized it too, understanding that stillness in his world rarely meant acceptance, and together they prepared without dramatics, neither bracing for collapse nor pretending immunity. The test came not as an attack on Adrian's empire, but as a challenge to Elena's credibility, delivered through a public forum that valued perception over truth, where questions were framed as concern and doubt disguised itself as professionalism. Elena was invited to speak on a panel meant to celebrate independent voices in art and culture, an opportunity that appeared validating on the surface, but carried undertones she could not ignore. When the narrative shifted mid-discussion toward influence and association, she realized the setup, understanding that the goal was not to expose wrongdoing, but to elicit reaction, to watch whether she would defend, deflect, or distance herself. She chose none of those. Instead, she spoke plainly, acknowledging her connection to Adrian without dramatizing it, clarifying that proximity did not equal compromise, and stating with calm precision that her work stood on its own merit, regardless of who stood beside her. The response was immediate and polarized, some applauding the honesty, others framing it as evasion, but the moment had passed without the fracture they sought. Adrian watched from a distance, resisting the urge to intervene, knowing that stepping in would only shift focus. And for the first time, Elena felt the full weight of being trusted not just emotionally, but strategically. The aftermath was louder than the event itself, commentary spreading across circles that thrived on interpretation, and Elena found herself at the center of a narrative she could not fully control. That night, exhaustion caught up with her, and for the first time, she questioned whether clarity was enough in a world that rewarded spectacle. Adrian listened as she spoke, hearing not doubt in their connection but fatigue in the constant defense of self, and he admitted that he had underestimated the personal cost of public integrity, not because it was wrong, but because it was relentless. The true test, however, came days later, when Adrian was presented with an opportunity to neutralize the pressure entirely, a strategic move that would redirect scrutiny away from Elena, but require a public decision that appeared to distance himself from her, not by denial, but by omission. The offer was framed as practical, even considerate, presented by people who understood leverage well enough to disguise it as advice. Adrian did not respond immediately, choosing instead to tell Elena everything, laying out the option without framing it as sacrifice or solution. He told her he would choose transparency over convenience, even if that choice carried consequence. Elena listened, recognizing the gravity of the moment, understanding that this was not about pride or defiance, but about whether their commitment to choice extended into moments where the cost was asymmetrical. She surprised herself by telling him that she did not want to be protected by erasure, that being unseen for comfort would feel like loss, not safety, and that if standing beside him invited challenge, she would rather face it openly than be preserved through silence. That decision, mutual and unforced, solidified something that had been forming slowly, not passion or possession, but partnership defined by consent. When Adrian declined the offer, he did so without explanation, without public counterstatement, allowing the refusal itself to speak, and the reaction was swift, not violent but destabilizing, as alliances recalibrated and assumptions fractured. Elena felt the tremor in her own world as well, as certain opportunities evaporated and others unexpectedly appeared, drawn not to safety but to conviction. The pressure did not disappear, but it changed texture, losing its sharpness as it failed to provoke the collapse it anticipated. In the quiet that followed, Elena and Adrian found themselves alone in a way they had not been before, not isolated from others, but certain of each other, and in that certainty, fear lost its urgency. One evening, as they walked through the city without destination, Elena realized that the claiming she had once resisted had never been about ownership at all, but about recognition freely given and freely accepted. Adrian had not claimed her by declaration, but by standing with her when retreat would have been easier, and she had chosen him not out of defiance, but out of alignment. The world continued to test, to measure, to demand proof, but the moment everything had been tested most deeply had already passed, not in public view, but in private clarity. And as they moved forward, not immune to consequence but grounded in intention, Elena understood that what they had built could withstand exposure, because it was not held together by secrecy or force, but by choice renewed under pressure. Elena felt the city around her differently now, as if the same streets and lights she had walked for years were sharper, more vivid, alive in a way that demanded awareness rather than passivity. Every corner seemed to hum with consequence, every conversation carried weight, yet the tension that had defined her connection with Adrian Blackwood for so long had shifted from uncertainty to clarity. The final piece of the journey had not been a confrontation, a declaration, or a grand gesture. It had been endurance, enduring scrutiny, enduring doubt, enduring the discomfort of being fully visible while remaining true to herself. That endurance had forged something neither of them could have anticipated, a bond not of ownership, not of control, but of choice exercised continuously, consciously, and unapologetically. Adrian entered her life quietly that evening, not with ceremony, not with force, but with presence. He had been in the city on business, the usual obligations requiring his attention, yet he had come because it was time to close the distance, not in physicality alone, but in understanding. Elena met him outside her apartment, the night cool, the streets empty except for the distant hum of traffic. And for the first time since everything began, there was no pretense, no social theater, only acknowledgement of what had already been established. "You're here," Elena said, voice calm but layered with unspoken tension. "I am," Adrian replied, eyes dark and steady, gaze unwavering. "I wasn't sure you'd allow it." Elena smiled faintly, the first real release of a tension she hadn't fully realized she was holding. "It's not about allowance," she said. "It's about recognition." He considered her words, the faint shadow of a smile crossing his lips. "Recognition," he echoed. "I can respect that." They walked together through the quiet streets, not discussing the past in detail, but acknowledging it in the subtle ways two people who had endured everything together often do. A glance, a pause, a shared step that matched cadence as naturally as breathing. The city around them faded into peripheral noise. They were both acutely aware of the space they occupied together. It was a space defined not by proximity alone, but by repeated choice, by the refusal to compromise principle for comfort or control. Weeks of negotiation, observation, and subtle maneuvering had culminated in this evening without ceremony. There had been no dramatic declarations in the press, no public acknowledgement of their bond, no calculated performances to show influence or power. Instead, there was mutual awareness and consent, the kind that could withstand observation, speculation, and opposition, because it did not rely on perception to exist. Adrian's hand brushed hers as they paused on a quiet corner, the gesture deliberate yet restrained. Elena did not flinch, did not pull away. Her hand met his halfway. There was no ownership in the touch, no claim, only acknowledgement of a shared choice that had been tested under pressure and had emerged intact. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly, voice almost lost in the wind, referring not to him, not to herself, but to everything that had led to this precise moment. Adrian shook his head slowly. "Regret implies I wished things had been easier," he said. "They weren't, but difficulty isn't regret, it's reality." Elena considered that. She had spent months navigating opportunity, scrutiny, distance, and observation, and she realized that every uncomfortable moment, every silent test, every moment of fear had reinforced what she now understood. She had chosen deliberately, and so had he. There had been no coercion, no manipulation, only continuous consent and recognition. "And if the world comes for us again?" she asked, half in jest, half in challenge. Adrian's gaze sharpened, but not with threat. "Then we meet it, as we always have." Her lips quirked into the faintest smile, the corners tilting with humor and relief. "And we endure." "Yes," he agreed. "Endure, adapt, and remain ourselves. Nothing else matters." The nights that followed were no longer tests. There were no subtle provocations, no challenges hidden behind politeness or strategic posturing. The city still moved, still whispered, still observed, but Elena had learned to navigate it without surrendering autonomy, and Adrian had demonstrated that presence did not require possession. Their bond had reached a stage of equilibrium that few could understand, but both recognized fully. They could exist in the same space without consuming one another, could participate in public life without compromising principle, could navigate scrutiny without losing agency. That reality was rare, and they both knew it. Adrian never made a grand claim, never attempted to announce control or ownership. He simply existed beside her, steady and deliberate, a presence defined by choice rather than domination. Elena reciprocated, neither seeking to be shielded nor to be used as leverage, acknowledging that partnership without sacrifice was possible, but only when both parties refused to compromise selfhood. Their conversations became quieter, deeper, no longer reactive but reflective. They spoke of fear, ambition, and the fragile lines that separate principle from surrender. They shared insight without expectation, presence without possession, and in those moments, the intensity of their bond surpassed drama or intrigue, because it was real in its simplicity and deliberate in its clarity. The final test of that bond came unexpectedly, not in confrontation but in opportunity. Adrian was presented with a high-stakes deal, one that could consolidate years of strategy into immediate dominance. The choice was not binary. To succeed fully, he would have to prioritize empire over presence, influence over principle. Elena's work was intertwined with the same circles, though independently. She watched him weigh the options, but there was no hesitation in their silent understanding. He did not ask her to step back. She did not offer to compromise. They trusted each other to act without coercion, and that trust proved more powerful than the deal itself. In the end, Adrian executed the strategy not for ego or influence, but with careful alignment, respecting both his empire and the life they had deliberately built together. That act, subtle yet defining, cemented the understanding that the greatest power was not force, but conscious choice exercised without apology. Later that evening, standing in the quiet of Adrian's penthouse, Elena looked out over the city that had once seemed indifferent and hostile and now seemed steady and expansive. She turned to him, voice soft but firm. "We've earned this," she said. "Not because the world made it easy, but because we refused to let it define us." Adrian's hand found hers again, steady and warm. "Exactly," he said. "No apologies, no hesitation, just presence and choice." For the first time since their paths had crossed, Elena allowed herself to breathe fully, feeling the weight of months of tests, distance, scrutiny, and endurance lift slightly, leaving clarity in its place. The world outside continued, indifferent and relentless as ever, but within the space they had claimed, nothing could erode what had been built. Mutual recognition, deliberate alignment, and the unspoken, unwavering decision to stand together without surrender. The city lights flickered below, reflecting the countless possibilities that still lay ahead. And for the first time, Elena realized that some bonds do not need ownership to exist, some power does not require dominance, and some choices, once made with clarity and intention, could withstand anything without apology. They did not need words to affirm it. The quiet understanding, the deliberate presence, the steady touch of hands, and the shared gaze over a city that had tested them at every turn said enough. They were together, not because fate demanded it, not because circumstance dictated it, but because they had chosen it, continuously and unapologetically. And in that choice, they found freedom.